December 30th, 2000. The Setagaya district of Tokyo holds its breath under a sky of iron gray. The air is sharp, biting, and carries a scent of frost from Setagaya Park. Inside the two-story house, the rhythm of the evening is absolute. Mikio Miyazawa moves through the rooms, finishing the final tasks of the year. In the quiet upstairs, Yasuko tucks Nina and Rei into their beds, pulling the blankets tight against the winter chill. There is no urgency here, only the steady, predictable pulse of a family preparing for sleep. They lock the front door. They turn off the lights, plunging the house into a deep, heavy silence. They expect the sun to rise on the final day of the millennium. They do not hear the wind shift. They do not see the stillness of the trees outside. The house is a sanctuary, a fortress of routine, and every lock clicked into place feels like a promise of safety. But the promise is hollow. The night is not merely cold, it is waiting. The second-story window offered no resistance. A latch clicked, then gave way. A shadow stepped from the freezing air of the balcony into the warmth of the hallway. The house, until this moment a fortress of order, became a hunting ground. There was no alarm, no sudden shout, only the sound of floorboards shifting under an unfamiliar weight. The intruder moved with purpose, navigating the dark corridors. In the bedrooms, the transition from sleep to the end was absolute. The silence that had defined the Miyazawa home for years was shattered. The struggle did not last long. By the time the first faint light of dawn began to bleed into the horizon, the house had changed. The sanctuary was gone. The rooms were still, but the life that had filled them had been extinguished in the dark. He did not leave. He did not run. He remained, a ghost in the making, while the world outside continued to sleep. The morning of December 31st arrived with a deceptive, pale clarity. The sun climbed over the Tokyo skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the Setagaya district. Yasuko's mother walked toward the house, her footsteps rhythmic against the pavement. She expected the usual morning bustle. She expected the children to run to the door. Instead, she found a house that felt unnaturally heavy. The silence was not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping home, it was a vacuum. She reached the entrance and knocked. No answer. She tried the door. It was locked, but the stillness behind the wood felt absolute. She moved to the side, her breath hitching in the frigid air as she peered through the glass. The scene inside did not register at first. It was a blur of shadows and unnatural angles. She pushed, she called out, but the house remained a tomb. When she finally gained entry, the reality of the morning collapsed. She found the bodies in the dim light of the hallway. The air inside was stagnant, smelling of cold metal and something sharp. She did not scream immediately. The shock took her breath, leaving her frozen in the doorway. Her hands trembled as she reached for the phone. She dialed the police, her voice thin and jagged against the silence. The report was brief, a few frantic words that shattered the morning peace. The first responders arrived with sirens cut, expecting the chaotic aftermath of a standard break-in. They moved through the rooms with practiced efficiency, looking for signs of a hasty exit, a broken lock, or a trail leading into the night. They found none. The house was not merely a site of violence. It was a space that had been inhabited. As the lead investigators moved deeper into the floor plan, the expected patterns of a fleeing perpetrator vanished. The evidence did not point toward a frantic escape. It pointed toward a deliberate, chilling pause. The officers stood in the hallway, their flashlights cutting through the dust, realizing that the perpetrator had not left when the sun began to rise. He had lingered. The realization hit the team like a physical weight. The scene defied every protocol they knew. A killer who stays is a killer who has no fear of discovery. Or worse, one who feels a sense of ownership over the space he has just violated. The investigators stopped, looking at each other, the silence of the house now feeling less like a tomb and more like a trap. The investigators moved through the rooms with a growing, visceral discomfort. Every surface they touched confirmed the impossible. This was not the chaotic aftermath of a struggle. It was the aftermath of a stay. They found items moved from the natural places, not in haste, but with a strange, methodical purpose. The killer had not just been present. He had been comfortable. He had navigated the hallways, touched the walls, and claimed the space as if he held a key. The lead detective knelt by a chair, his gloved hand hovering over a surface that had been used, not destroyed. The team exchanged looks, the gravity of the situation shifting from a hunt for a fugitive to the study of a ghost. He had walked these floors while the night was still dark, moving between the rooms with a calm that defied the horror he had left behind. They began to map his path, tracing the sequence of his movements through the house. It was a timeline of mundane, domestic actions performed in the shadow of slaughter. The realization was absolute. The killer had not fled the scene because he had not felt like an intruder. He had felt like a guest. The kitchen was the final frontier of the investigation. The detectives stepped into the small, tiled space, their flashlights illuminating the refrigerator door. It stood slightly ajar, a detail that felt like a scream in the quiet room. They pulled it open. Inside, the shelves told a story that defied the brutality of the previous hours. A melon sat on the middle shelf, sliced with a precision that suggested a calm, steady hand. Beside it, a container of ice cream had been opened, the surface softened and partially consumed. The investigator stared at the remnants of the meal. There was no haste here, no adrenaline-fueled flight, only the deliberate, rhythmic act of a man satisfying a hunger while the house remained silent around him. He had stood in this exact spot, the cold air of the refrigerator washing over his face, choosing what to eat, as if he were a resident returning from a long day. The lead detective reached out, his gloved fingers hovering near the half-eaten melon, unable to reconcile the predator with the person who had calmly sat down to eat. The killer had not just occupied the space, he had treated the home as his own pantry, finding comfort in the very sanctuary he had just dismantled. The trail of the intruder led away from the kitchen, deeper into the private quarters of the home. The investigators followed the path into the bathroom, where the air felt heavy and stagnant. Here the killer had shed the remnants of his own violent actions. On the floor lay the discarded items he had arrived in, soaked and stained, a physical record of the struggle that had taken place hours earlier. He had not simply left them behind. He had systematically stripped them away. The detectives moved with extreme caution, documenting the pile of discarded material that marked the end of his original presence. Then, they turned their attention to the closet. The killer had reached into the private space of the man he had just ended, pulling out fresh items to replace his own. He had systematically removed his own identity, piece by piece, and replaced it with the belongings of his victim. He was no longer the intruder. The evidence of this exchange lay scattered and rearranged, a chilling testament to a man who sought to erase himself by becoming someone else entirely. The final stage of the intruder's occupation led him to the study. The investigators entered the room, their beams of light cutting through the darkness to land on the desk. The computer sat there, a silent witness to the final hours of the night. The detectives approached, noting the keyboard and the mouse, which had been handled with a terrifying lack of urgency. He had sat in the chair, the very seat where the master of the house had once worked, and he had turned the machine on. The screen had flickered to life, casting a pale, artificial glow over the desk. He had navigated the web, clicking through pages and links with a steady, rhythmic cadence. There was no panic in his movements, no frantic searching, just the deliberate, methodical actions of someone browsing the internet as if he had all the time in the world. The investigators pulled up the logs, tracing the digital path he had carved into the machine. Every click, every site visited, every second spent staring at the monitor was now etched into the history of the device. He had left behind a trail of data that mapped his thoughts, his interests, and his chillingly calm state of mind. The detective stood in the quiet study, the weight of the digital evidence pressing down on them. He had not just occupied the home. He had used its tools to anchor himself in the modern world, leaving behind a digital ghost that would haunt the investigation for decades to come. The study was only the beginning of the trail. As the forensic teams fanned out across the house, they began to collect a staggering inventory of physical evidence. On a side table, they found a knife, its blade still holding the residue of the night. Nearby, a hat and a scarf were recovered, items that had no place in the family home. Each object was tagged and bagged, a tangible piece of the intruder left behind in his wake. But the physical items were only the surface. The investigators moved from room to room, discovering a mountain of biological data. In every corner, on every surface, the killer had left his own DNA. It was on the floor, on the furniture, and in the very air of the rooms. The sheer volume of material was unprecedented. The detectives looked at the evidence bags piling up on the floor, their confidence rising with each new discovery. They had a profile, they had physical objects, they had genetic markers that should have led to an immediate identification. The logic of the investigation seemed absolute. With this much evidence, The killer could not possibly remain hidden. They mapped his movements, tracked his presence, and felt the weight of the case closing in on a suspect who had left his entire life story behind in the house. The sun rose on the first day of the new millennium, casting long, cold shadows over the Setagaya district. Inside the house, the investigators waited for the call that would confirm a match. They held the DNA, the items, and the digital logs, expecting the system to yield a name. But the system returned nothing. The hours ticked by, and the initial certainty began to fracture. They checked the perimeter, then the streets, then the wider city, but the trail had simply ceased to exist. The killer had not been caught in a dragnet. He had not been tripped up by his own mistakes. He had walked out of that front door and dissolved into the Tokyo night. By the time the sun set on that first day of the year, the reality settled over the precinct like a shroud. The man who had occupied the house was gone. He was a ghost in the machine, a silhouette that had slipped through the fingers of modern science. The investigators stood in the empty rooms, the silence now absolute. He had left everything behind, yet he had taken his identity with him. He had vanished into the darkness, leaving the police to stare at a mountain of clues that led nowhere. 24 years have bled into the calendar since that winter night. The case remains a jagged, open wound in the records of the Tokyo Metropolitan Police. Forensic teams have processed the house 1,000 times, returning to the same rooms, the same floorboards, and the same chilling silence. They have mapped the killer's every movement with surgical precision. They have analyzed the DNA, which suggests he possessed a mixed-race heritage, a detail that widens the search to a global scale. They have traced the origin of the garments he left behind, following threads across borders and through manufacturing logs. Yet, every lead hits a wall of absolute nothingness. The identity of the man remains a void, a blank space where a name should be. Modern science, with all its power to decode the human blueprint, has proven insufficient against this phantom. The investigators possess the biological markers, the digital footprints, and the physical remnants of his presence, but they lack the one thing that matters, a person to hold accountable. The trail has not just gone cold, it has evaporated, leaving behind only the agonizing, unanswered question of who walked out of that house and into the Tokyo night. For 13 years, the house stood as a silent, physical monument to the failure of modern investigation. It was a place where time had frozen, holding the echoes of the crime within its walls. Investigators returned to it repeatedly, hoping that a new perspective or a more advanced technology might finally unlock the secret. But the house kept its silence. In 2013, the decision was made to tear it down. The wrecking ball swung, and the structure that had witnessed the final moments of the family was reduced to rubble and dust. By erasing the physical space, the mystery was stripped of its last anchor. The house was gone, but the void it contained only grew larger. The site was cleared, the debris hauled away, and the land leveled, but the absence of the building mirrored the absence of the killer. The house had been the only tangible link to the man who stayed, and with its collapse, the investigation was left to drift. The case of the Setagaya family remains a haunting reminder that in a world of surveillance and science, a person can still vanish into thin air, while leaving their entire life story behind. The killer remains a silhouette in the records, a name never spoken, and a face never seen. He walked out of that house, into the Tokyo night, and into a darkness that no amount of evidence has ever been able to pierce. We are left to wonder about the man who stayed. Was it arrogance that kept him there for hours, or a distorted sense of comfort in the wreckage he created? Did he know the family, or was this a random selection of a house near a park? The lack of a clear motive is the most agonizing part of the puzzle. He left his own DNA, his own belongings, and his own habits scattered across the rooms, yet he never left a trace of who he actually was. He discarded his own past, his own identity, and his own humanity within those walls, yet he walked away with his secret intact. He left the family behind, but he never left himself behind. The question remains, hanging in the cold winter air, waiting for an answer that may never come. Who was the man who stayed, and why did he leave the family behind but never his own shadow?